Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everybody. Today we're doing a deep dive into something that might just rewrite your understanding of American history. The relationship between the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement.
Okay.
You've probably heard of both, maybe even seen those iconic images of marches and protests. But what if we told you the typical timeline? Civil rights followed by Black Power is missing a huge piece of the story.
It's true. We often think of these movements as separate chapters, neatly divided, but the truth is much more fascinating.
Okay.
Recent scholarship reveals these movements were actually deeply intertwined with elements of what we now call Black Power, simmering long before the term became a rallying cry.
So let's unpack that. Most of us have that classic timeline in our heads. Civil rights spanning the late 50s and early 60s.
Right.
Followed by Black Power emerging later in the 60s.
Yeah.
But you're saying that's an oversimplification.
Exactly. The traditional chronology, while helpful for a basic understanding, misses crucial nuances.
Okay.
It overlooks how these movements were happening simultaneously, influencing and shaping each other in ways we're only beginning to fully appreciate.
So where do we even begin to unravel this more complex narrative?
Well, we can start by thinking about the limitations of that traditional timeline.
Okay.
It leads us to believe that Black Power only emerged as a response to the perceived shortcomings of the civil rights movement. But what if Black Power existed before the label itself gained popularity?
Now, that's a thought-provoking idea. Are there specific examples that challenge that traditional timeline?
Absolutely. Let's take Gloria Richardson, for instance.
Okay.
She was leading protests in Cambridge, Maryland in the early 1960s. Demanding economic equality and advocating for self-defense.
Okay.
This was years before Black Power became a national slogan.
So she was already embodying those core principles of self-determination and community empowerment that would later define the Black Power movement. It's like the seeds were already being sown, even as the civil rights movement was gaining momentum.
Precisely. And she's not an isolated case. Think back to Robert Williams and his NAACP chapter in Monroe, North Carolina in the 1950s.
Okay.
He was openly challenging the NAACP's commitment to nonviolence.
Oh, wow.
Arguing for armed self-defense against racist violence.
Okay.
This was a full decade before Stokely Carmichael popularized the phrase Black Power.
Wow, that's incredible. It really shows how the traditional narrative misses these early expressions of what we now associate with Black Power. It makes you wonder, how did someone like Robert Williams advocating for self-defense even exist within the NAACP at that time?
It's a fascinating question, and it gets to the heart of why this revised understanding of the movement is so important. Williams faced immense pushback for his stance even being suspended from the NAACP.
Wow.
But his ideas resonated deeply with many in the Black community who were tired of being victims of violence without any means of protecting themselves.
It makes sense. You mentioned those iconic images of the civil rights movement.
Yes.
The lunch counter sit-ins, the freedom rides. But the movement's focus was primarily on dismantling legal segregation in the South.
Right.
What about the inequalities faced by Black communities in the North and West?
That's a crucial point. While the civil rights movement was achieving landmark victories, issues like de facto segregation, police brutality, and economic inequality persisted in northern and western cities.
Yeah.
And this is where Black Power truly resonated. It addressed those systemic issues that went beyond legal desegregation.
So it wasn't just about changing the laws. It was about changing the power dynamics themselves.
Exactly. Black Power challenged the very idea that simply integrating into a society built on systemic racism would bring true equality. It emphasized self-reliance, economic empowerment, and controlling the narrative of Black identity and liberation.
So how did this shift manifest itself? How are the approaches of the civil rights movement and Black Power different?
Well, while the civil rights movement primarily focused on nonviolent civil disobedience and legislative reform, Black Power embraced a wider range of tactics. Think about the Black Panther Party, for example. They patrolled their communities to monitor police activity, established free breakfast programs for children, and advocated for community control of resources.
The Black Panthers are definitely one of the most well-known symbols of Black Power.
Right.
But it sounds like their approach was both practical and ideological, addressing immediate needs while also pushing for a broader systemic change.
That's exactly right. They are about empowering Black communities from the ground up, while simultaneously challenging the structures of power that perpetuated inequality.
This is already painting a much more complex and nuanced picture of this era.
Yeah.
It's like we're realizing there wasn't a clean break between these movements, but rather a constant interplay of ideas and strategies.
Exactly. And that's where the real aha moment comes in. To truly understand this period, we need to move beyond those neat categories.
Right.
And embrace the messiness, the overlaps, and the often unsung figures who defied easy categorization.
You've definitely piqued my curiosity. I'm ready to delve deeper into the stories of those individuals who challenged traditional boundaries and explore how they fit into this more nuanced timeline.
Let's do it. Let's start with Robert F. Williams.
Robert F. Williams, heading up an NAACP chapter in the 50s and advocating for armed self-defense.
Right.
That just seems so unexpected.
Yeah.
It really challenges how we typically think about the civil rights movement.
It certainly does. And that's precisely why Williams is such a pivotal figure in understanding this complex history. His story highlights the diversity of thought and tactics within the movement for Black freedom.
Okay.
Remember, this was a time when racial violence was rampant.
Right.
And the legal system often failed to protect Black communities.
So for him, it was about taking a stand and saying, we have a right to defend ourselves when the authorities won't.
Precisely. Williams argued that relying solely on white institutions for protection was simply not enough. Black people needed to be prepared to defend themselves, their families, and their communities.
Right.
And his message resonated deeply, especially in the South, where the threat of racial violence was a constant reality.
It's hard to imagine how radical his stance must have seemed at the time.
Right.
Especially within the NAACP.
Oh, absolutely.
An organization known for its commitment to nonviolent resistance.
Williams's ideas sparked fierce debate within the NAACP, eventually leading to his suspension.
Wow.
But for Williams, it was about recognizing the limitations of nonviolence in the face of unrelenting aggression.
So he was essentially pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable within the movement, forcing people to confront the harsh realities of racial violence.
He was.
Oh.
And what's even more fascinating is that despite the controversy, his ideas about self-defense would later become central to the Black Power movement.
Right.
Figures like Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panthers would echo his call for armed resistance in the face of oppression.
It's like he was a precursor to Black Power, planting the seeds of a more militant approach to achieving Black liberation. And speaking of figures who challenged traditional boundaries, you mentioned Gloria Richardson earlier.
Yes.
What made her such a compelling figure in this narrative?
Gloria Richardson is another prime example of how the traditional timeline of these movements breaks down when you look at the lived experiences of activists on the ground. She was a leader in the Cambridge movement, which, as you mentioned, was fighting for economic equality and housing rights in Maryland in the early 60s.
So she was already tackling those systemic issues of economic injustice that would become central to the Black Power movement later on.
Exactly. Richardson understood that true liberation required more than just desegregation. It demanded economic justice and control over Black communities.
Okay.
And like Robert Williams, she wasn't afraid to advocate for self-defense when necessary.
So she was a true bridge between the movements embodying elements of both the civil rights movement's focus on legal equality and the Black Power movement's emphasis on self-determination and economic empowerment.
She was a remarkable figure who defied easy categorization. And she was far from alone. Throughout the South and in northern cities, activists were challenging the status quo, demanding change, and experimenting with different approaches to achieving Black freedom.
And it's in this context that we see the phrase Black Power explode onto the national scene in 1966.
Yes, and that moment is inextricably linked to Stokely Carmichael, who, as you'll recall, was the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, at the time. During the Meredith March in Mississippi, he famously uttered those words, Black Power, giving voice to the growing frustration among young activists, with a slow pace of change and the limitations of integration.
You can almost feel the energy and the urgency in those two words. It must have felt like a turning point.
It absolutely was.
A call for a more radical approach.
Carmichael's declaration marked a shift in the movement, reflecting a growing impatience with the incremental progress of traditional civil rights tactics. It signaled a desire for more immediate and tangible change.
And the shift towards Black Power was about more than just changing laws, right?
Precisely.
It was about a fundamental change in power dynamics.
It was about Black people defining their own goals, their own strategies, and their own vision for liberation. It was about self-reliance, economic autonomy, and taking control of the narrative.
And that's where the Black Panther Party comes in.
Absolutely. The Black Panthers, founded that same year by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California, became the most iconic symbol of Black power. They embodied this new spirit of militancy and self-determination.
There's such a powerful image of that era. Those black berets, the raised fists, the unwavering commitment to challenging the status quo. But their work went far beyond symbolism, didn't it?
Absolutely. The Black Panthers were about putting those Black power ideals into action. They addressed issues that the civil rights movement hadn't fully tackled. Police brutality, economic inequality, and the need for community control.
So they weren't just talking about revolution. They were creating programs and initiatives to empower their communities.
Exactly. They organized armed patrols to monitor police activity, challenging police brutality head-on. They established those free breakfast programs for children, ensuring that kids in their communities had access to a nutritious meal. And they set up health clinics, providing essential healthcare services to those who are often neglected by the system. They were truly about empowering Black communities from the ground up.
It's fascinating how they combined this practical approach to community service with a radical political ideology.
They understood that true liberation required addressing the immediate needs of their communities, while simultaneously challenging the systems that created those needs in the first place. And their impact was undeniable.
But their boldness, their willingness to openly challenge authority also made them a target. Didn't the FBI's COINTELPRO program specifically target the Black Panthers?
They absolutely did. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover saw the Black Panthers as a major threat. Their effectiveness in mobilizing communities, their armed patrols, and their revolutionary rhetoric fueled fear and paranoia within the government.
So the FBI used surveillance infiltration and disinformation tactics to try and discredit and dismantle the Black Panthers.
That's right. The government's response to the Black Panthers highlights how the fight for Black freedom often provoked fear and backlash from those in power.
It's a stark reminder that progress rarely comes without a fight. And that those who challenge the status quo often face repression and resistance.
It's true. And it's a reminder that the fight for social justice is an ongoing struggle, one that requires vigilance, courage, and a willingness to confront those who seek to maintain the existing power structures.
We've covered so much ground already, from Robert Williams's early calls for self-defense to the rise of the Black Panthers and the complexities of the Black Power movement. But I'm curious, how do historians today make sense of this intricate and often messy period of history? How do they reconcile these seemingly disparate threads?
That's a great question, and it leads us to a fascinating discussion about how different schools of thought within historiography approach this era. Each offering unique insights or perspectives on the civil rights movement and Black power.
So we've got these different schools of thought among historians trying to make sense of the civil rights movement and Black power. Is it like they're each looking at the same picture but through different lenses?
That's a great way to put it. Each school of thought emphasizes certain aspects, highlights different figures, and offers unique interpretations of this complex period. Let's take the liberal civil rights historiography lens, for example. This perspective tends to focus on the achievements of the civil rights movement, particularly those landmark legislative victories like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act.
Those are huge wins, no doubt.
Absolutely.
They fundamentally changed the legal landscape of America.
Absolutely. And for historians working within this school of thought, those victories are seen as the culmination of years of struggle and sacrifice, a testament to the power of nonviolent resistance. They often view the Black Power movement as a more radical offshoot, one that, while born out of legitimate frustrations, ultimately hindered the progress made by the civil rights movement.
So from that perspective, Black power is seen as a bit of a disruption, maybe even a step backward in the fight for equality.
You could say that they often point to the rise of Black nationalism and the emphasis on Black separatism as evidence of this division. But then you have radical Black historiography, which offers a very different interpretation.
So how do they see things differently?
Well, this perspective argues that Black power was essential in pushing the conversation beyond legal equality to address those deeper systemic issues of economic inequality, police brutality, and cultural representation.
Okay.
They see Black power as a necessary corrective to the limitations of the civil rights movement,
right.
a continuation of the struggle for Black liberation on a broader and more radical front.
It's like they're saying, okay, we got the laws changed, but now we need to dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality, even in the absence of explicit segregation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they often highlight figures like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers as examples of this more radical and uncompromising approach.
Right.
Remember those issues of economic inequality and police brutality that the Black Panthers were addressing are still very much relevant today.
That's a powerful point. It shows how the legacies of these movements continue to shape our conversations about race and equality in the 21st century.
It does. And then you have the social history perspective, which offers yet another layer of understanding. Social historians tend to zoom in on the grassroots level, focusing on the experiences of everyday people and the local leaders who are often overlooked in the grand narratives of these movements.
So it's less about the big names and more about the countless individuals who were organizing, protesting, and building communities from the ground up.
Exactly. They highlight figures like Gloria Richardson and Robert Williams, whose stories we discussed earlier, as examples of how radical ideas and tactics were present long before the Black Power movement gained national attention. They emphasize the diversity of approaches and the complex web of influences that shaped these movements.
It seems like each of these perspectives offers a valuable piece of the puzzle, helping us to see this period with more clarity and nuance.
They do. And finally, we have the Cold War historiography lens, which examines how the global political climate of the time, particularly the anxiety surrounding communism, influenced the government's response to both movements.
This is where we see how Cold War fears shaped perceptions and led to things like the FBI's COINTELPRO program.
That's right. The government often viewed Black Power organizations as a threat to national security, associating them with communism and radicalism, even though their goals were centered on racial justice and equality. This lens helps us understand how external factors can influence the way social movements are perceived and treated.
So we've got these 4 distinct lenses through which to view this period of history. It seems like each one offers valuable insights, but how do we reconcile them? How do we arrive at a more holistic understanding?
That's the million-dollar question. And I think the key takeaway here is that there isn't one definitive answer, one correct way to view this complex and multifaceted history. The beauty of historical inquiry is that it's an ongoing process of interpretation and reinterpretation.
It's about embracing the complexity and understanding that there are multiple truths, multiple perspectives that all contribute to a richer understanding.
Exactly. Instead of trying to draw a definitive line between the civil rights movement and Black Power, we should see them as intertwined forces, each shaping and influencing the other in profound ways.
I love that. It reminds us that history isn't static. It's a dynamic and ever-evolving narrative.
It is. And as we grapple with issues of race and equality today, it's crucial to remember that these movements didn't happen in a vacuum. They were products of their time, shaped by historical forces and influenced by the individuals who dared to challenge the status quo.
This has been an incredible journey. We've challenged the traditional timeline, explored the complexities of both movements, and delved into the stories of those who defied easy categorization.
It has been fascinating.
What a fantastic deep dive. We hope this has sparked your curiosity. The civil rights movement and Black Power weren't just events of the past. Their legacies continue to shape our world today. So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.